The shirt you are wearing right now was probably picked by a machine. But for roughly 300 years, that exact same task was done by enslaved people, forced into fields at gunpoint, dawn until dark, for the entire length of their lives. And in the world today, there is a real chance that somewhere in the fabric, touching your skin right now, a portion of that cotton was picked under conditions that international human rights investigators have documented as forced labor. 1 in 5 garments sold globally is estimated to contain cotton connected to a single region in Western China, a region where credible reporting has documented mass detention and coerced work. This is not ancient history sitting safely behind glass in a museum. This is the shirt on your back. And the story of how we got here starts thousands of years before anyone had ever heard the word Britain, or America, or China, in a river valley in South Asia where humans first figured out how to turn a fuzzy little seed pod into thread. The Indus Valley civilization, flourishing across what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, roughly 5,000 years ago, left behind something that changed the trajectory of human clothing forever. Archaeologists excavating sites connected to this ancient civilization discovered fragments of woven cotton fabric dating back to approximately 3,000 years before the Common Era, making it the oldest cotton textile ever found anywhere on Earth. This was not some crude accidental discovery. By the time these fragments were woven, the people of the Indus Valley had already developed a sophisticated understanding of how to cultivate cotton plants, harvest the fluffy white fibers surrounding their seeds, spin those fibers into thread using hand tools, and weave that thread into fabric fine enough to survive in fragmentary form for 5,000 years. Cotton itself is a genuinely strange plant when you stop to think about what it actually is. The fiber humans have spent millennia obsessing over is not a stem, not a leaf, not anything resembling the rest of the plant. It is a soft, fluffy covering that grows directly around the seeds inside a cotton boll, evolved by the plant purely as a mechanism to help those seeds catch the wind and disperse. Humans looked at this fluffy seed covering and saw something the plant never intended, a fiber long enough, strong enough, and soft enough to spin into thread and weave into cloth that could be worn against human skin far more comfortably than the wool, animal hides, or coarse plant fibers like flax that most other early civilizations relied upon. Once people figured this out, there was no going back. Indus Valley farmers and weavers spent generations refining this process, developing early spinning tools and simple looms that allowed them to produce cotton textiles at a scale significant enough to support trade. Evidence suggests cotton cultivation and weaving techniques spread outward from this region across the following centuries, moving into other parts of South Asia, and eventually India would go on to develop by far the most sophisticated and dominant cotton textile industry the ancient and medieval world had ever seen. For roughly 4,000 years following those first Indus Valley fragments, India would remain the undisputed center of global cotton production and cotton craftsmanship. A position of dominance so complete that it would eventually draw the attention and then the deliberate hostility of one of the most powerful empires in human history. By the time European traders began establishing serious contact with India through companies like the British East India Company in the early 1600s, Indian cotton textiles had reached a level of quality that genuinely stunned the rest of the world. Indian weavers, particularly in regions like Bengal and along the Coromandel Coast, produced cotton fabrics of extraordinary fineness, muslin so light and delicately woven that a full length of fabric could reportedly be pulled through a small ring, and calico, a lighter, printed cotton cloth that became wildly fashionable across Europe once it began arriving in significant quantities during the 1600s and early 1700s. European consumers accustomed to heavier wool and linen fabrics encountered Indian cotton and fell in love almost instantly. It was lighter, it was more comfortable, it held vibrant, dyed colors and printed patterns far better than European textiles could manage, and demand exploded across Britain, France, and the rest of Europe. This explosion in popularity created an enormous problem for one very specific group of people: English wool and linen manufacturers, who suddenly found themselves losing customers to a foreign import they simply could not compete with on quality. Rather than accept this competitive reality, English textile manufacturers did something that would set a grim precedent for how powerful economic interests deal with superior foreign competition. They lobbied Parliament, and Parliament listened. Beginning in the year 1699 and intensifying with a much stronger law passed in the year 1721, the British Parliament passed a series of laws that came to be known as the Calico Acts. These laws did not attempt to compete with Indian cotton textiles on quality or price. They simply banned the import and sale of most finished Indian cotton textiles within England outright, and later even restricted the wearing of printed cotton calico by English consumers, with real financial penalties attached for violations. This was protectionism of the most direct and brutally effective kind, a wealthy, powerful government using legislative force to crush a foreign industry that its own domestic manufacturers could not defeat through honest competition. India's textile industry, which had dominated global cotton trade for roughly 4,000 years, built on skill, craftsmanship, and genuine market demand, was being deliberately strangled, not because it had failed, but specifically because it had succeeded too well against British interests. The Calico Acts represent one of the more overlooked but genuinely consequential acts of economic warfare in early modern history, and their effects rippled forward for well over a century. British manufacturers used the breathing room these protectionist laws provided to develop their own domestic cotton textile industry from essentially nothing, importing raw cotton fiber rather than finished cloth, and gradually building up the mechanical and industrial capacity that would eventually allow Britain to manufacture cotton textiles at a scale and speed no handcraftsman anywhere in the world, including India, could ever hope to match. By the time the Industrial Revolution reached full force in Britain during the late 1700s, powered by mechanized spinning and weaving equipment running in massive factories fueled first by water power and later by steam, British cotton manufacturing had transformed from a protected domestic industry into a global economic juggernaut. India, meanwhile, having lost its own protected access to European markets decades earlier, and now facing a flood of cheap, mass-produced British cotton textiles imported back into India itself under British colonial economic policy, saw its once dominant textile industry collapse into a shadow of what it had been. Millions of skilled Indian weavers whose families had practiced this craft for generations lost their livelihoods in a story historians would later come to recognize as one of history's clearest examples of deliberate deindustrialization, one nation's ancient economic strength dismantled specifically to serve the industrial ambitions of another. But British factories, however mechanically sophisticated, still needed an enormous and constantly growing supply of raw cotton fiber to feed their spinning machines and looms. And this need would drive one of the darkest chapters in the entire history of this fiber, a chapter centered not in India or Britain, but across the American South. Cotton had arrived in the American colonies relatively early, grown on a modest scale throughout the 1700s, but it faced a genuinely difficult processing bottleneck that limited how profitable it could ever become at scale. The variety of cotton that grew easily across most of the American South, called short staple cotton, produced fiber that was tightly bound to sticky green seeds embedded throughout the cotton boll, and separating that fiber from those seeds by hand was an agonizingly slow process. A single enslaved worker, laboring by hand, might manage to clean only about 1 pound of usable cotton fiber in an entire day of exhausting work. A bottleneck so severe that it genuinely limited how much cotton plantation owners found it profitable to grow in the first place, regardless of how much land or how many enslaved workers they had available to plant and harvest the crop. Then, in the year 1793, a Yale-educated inventor named Eli Whitney, working on a plantation in Georgia, built a simple mechanical device designed to solve exactly this problem. The cotton gin used a hand-cranked drum fitted with wire teeth that pulled cotton fiber through narrow slots too small for the seeds to pass through, mechanically separating fiber from seed at a speed that made the old hand-cleaning process look almost absurdly primitive by comparison. A single cotton gin, operated by 1 or 2 workers, could clean roughly 50 pounds of cotton fiber in a single day, a productivity increase of roughly 50 times over hand cleaning. Whitney patented his invention, and it spread across the American South at a speed that matched the sheer scale of the opportunity it had just unlocked. Here is where this story takes its darkest and most historically significant turn, and it directly contradicts what a lot of people assume happened when this invention entered the world. A device that eliminated the single biggest processing bottleneck in cotton production should, by simple economic logic, have reduced the demand for human labor, since machines were now doing work that previously required extensive manual effort. That is not remotely what happened. The cotton gin did not reduce the American South's reliance on enslaved labor. It dramatically intensified it, and the reason lies in understanding exactly which part of the cotton production process the gin actually mechanized. The cotton gin solved the processing bottleneck, cleaning the fiber, after it had already been harvested. It did absolutely nothing to mechanize the planting, cultivating, or picking of cotton in the fields themselves. Tasks that remained entirely dependent on intensive manual labor performed under brutal physical conditions for the entire growing season. Removing the processing bottleneck meant that, for the first time, growing enormous quantities of cotton actually made overwhelming economic sense, because plantation owners no longer had to worry about a mountain of unprocessed cotton sitting useless in storage, waiting for slow hand cleaning. The gin made cotton wildly, explosively profitable, and that explosion in profitability created a correspondingly explosive demand for more enslaved field workers to plant and pick ever larger cotton harvests across ever-expanding plantation acreage. The numbers behind this expansion are genuinely staggering. In the years immediately following Eli Whitney's invention, cotton production across the American South began a dramatic upward climb, and the enslaved population supporting that production climbed right alongside it. Within roughly 20 years of the cotton gin's invention, historians estimate that the enslaved population within the United States grew by approximately 4 million additional people. A horrifying expansion directly tied to the newly unleashed profitability of cotton cultivation across the Deep South. Land that had previously been considered marginal or unprofitable for cotton cultivation was rapidly bought up, cleared, and planted, driving a massive forced migration of enslaved people from the older slaveholding states of the Upper South, states like Virginia and Maryland, into the newer cotton frontier states of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and eventually Texas. A forced displacement historians now refer to as the Second Middle Passage, a phrase deliberately echoing the horror of the original transatlantic slave trade because of the sheer scale of families separated, sold, and marched or shipped hundreds of miles to work newly opened cotton land. This is the central brutal irony sitting at the heart of the cotton gin's legacy, and it is worth stating plainly because so many people carry the opposite assumption without ever examining it closely. A labor-saving invention did not free anyone from labor. It made human bondage more profitable than it had ever been in American history, and the American South, rather than moving away from slavery as industrialization theoretically might have suggested, doubled down on it with a ferocity that reshaped the entire economic and political trajectory of the United States. By the 1850s, cotton grown by enslaved labor across the American South had become so economically dominant that it accounted for well over half of all American exports, and Southern political leaders openly and explicitly declared cotton to be king, building an entire regional economy, social structure, and eventually a full-scale rebellion against the United States government, specifically to preserve the system of slavery that cotton profitability had made so ferociously valuable. The American Civil War, when it finally erupted in the year 1861, was fought over the future of an institution that a supposedly labor-saving machine had made drastically more entrenched, not less, 6 decades earlier. British textile mills, it is worth noting, were deeply intertwined with this entire system, even though slavery itself had been abolished within Britain and its colonies decades before the American Civil War began. The overwhelming majority of raw cotton fiber feeding Britain's massive industrial textile mills throughout the early and middle 1800s came directly from cotton grown by enslaved labor across the American South, meaning the British industrial economy that had crushed India's textile industry through the Calico Acts was now, simultaneously, deeply dependent on American slavery to keep its own factories running. When the American Civil War disrupted Southern cotton exports during the early 1860s, it triggered what historians call the Cotton Famine, a genuine economic crisis across British textile manufacturing regions like Lancashire, forcing British mill owners to scramble for alternative cotton sources, including a renewed push into cotton cultivation across British-controlled India and Egypt, further entangling the global cotton trade across multiple continents and multiple systems of forced or exploited labor simultaneously. Following the end of the American Civil War and the abolition of slavery within the United States in the year 1865, cotton cultivation across the American South did not simply return to normal under a fair wage labor system. A new arrangement emerged called sharecropping, in which formerly enslaved people and poor white farmers alike worked land owned by wealthy landowners in exchange for a share of the crop, an arrangement that on paper offered freedom, but in practice frequently trapped families in cycles of debt and dependency that, for many, differed from slavery, primarily in name rather than in daily lived experience. Cotton remained the economic backbone of the American South well into the 20th century, and the deep social and racial inequalities cotton's plantation economy had built into Southern society persisted for generations following emancipation, shaping American civil rights struggles that would continue for well over a century afterward. Mechanization eventually did arrive for the cotton harvest itself, though it took considerably longer than the mechanization of cotton cleaning. Mechanical cotton pickers capable of doing the field labor that human hands had performed for centuries were developed and gradually adopted across the American South throughout the middle decades of the 20th century, finally genuinely displacing the manual labor that cotton cultivation had always demanded. This mechanization contributed significantly to the Great Migration, the massive movement of Black Americans out of the rural South and into northern and western cities throughout the 20th century, as the agricultural labor system that had defined Southern Black life for generations following emancipation finally began disappearing under the pressure of new farm machinery. Cotton production today has scaled to a level that would have been almost unimaginable to anyone living through these earlier chapters of its history. Global cotton production now reaches roughly 25 million metric tons annually, grown across dozens of countries and woven into a textile industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars, clothing billions of people across every continent on Earth. China, India, and the United States rank among the largest cotton-producing nations in the world today, alongside significant production across Pakistan, Brazil, and several countries throughout West Africa and Central Asia. But within this modern global cotton supply chain sits a specific, deeply documented crisis that connects directly back to the darkest patterns running throughout this entire history. Forced labor, once again embedded in the production of the fiber the world depends on to clothe itself. The Xinjiang region of Western China has become, over the past decade, one of the largest cotton-producing regions on the entire planet, responsible for a substantial share of China's total cotton output. And China itself is among the largest cotton producers in the world. Human rights investigators, journalists, and multiple governments have documented extensive evidence of mass detention facilities operating across Xinjiang, holding significant portions of the region's Uyghur Muslim population and other ethnic minorities, alongside credible, extensively documented reports of forced labor programs connecting detained individuals and coerced local workers directly to cotton picking and cotton processing operations across the region. The scale of Xinjiang's integration into the global cotton supply chain means that separating this cotton out of international clothing production has proven genuinely difficult for governments, human rights organizations, and even well-intentioned clothing brands attempting to audit their own supply chains. Estimates from researchers and human rights organizations examining global cotton and textile supply chains have suggested that roughly 1 in 5 cotton garments sold anywhere in the world contains cotton connected in some way to Xinjiang. A figure reflecting just how deeply integrated this specific region has become into the raw material sourcing that feeds textile mills and clothing manufacturers across the entire planet, including many major international clothing brands whose products fill shelves in stores across the United States, Europe, and elsewhere. Several governments, including the United States, have passed legislation specifically restricting the import of goods connected to Xinjiang cotton production over forced labor concerns, though enforcing these restrictions across a supply chain. This vast, complex, and often deliberately obscured through intermediary processing in other countries remains a genuinely difficult, ongoing challenge. This means that the uncomfortable, deeply unsettling truth sitting behind this entire 8,000-year history is that cotton's relationship with coerced and forced human labor did not end with the abolition of slavery in the United States during the 1860s. And it did not end with the mechanization of cotton picking during the 20th century. It simply moved geographically and institutionally into a new form in a new region, under a new set of political and economic circumstances, while the fundamental pattern connecting cheap cotton to exploited human labor has persisted in some form across nearly the entire documented history of this fiber. Step back and look at the full sweep of this story, and the pattern becomes almost impossible to ignore. Ancient weavers along the Indus River figured out 5,000 years ago how to turn a fuzzy seed covering into fabric fine enough to survive millennia buried in the ground. Indian craftsmen built an industry so sophisticated and so dominant that it took a deliberate act of British legislative force, the Calico Acts, to crush it, clearing space for Britain's own industrial cotton empire to rise in its place. That empire's endless appetite for raw fiber helped drive the invention of the cotton gin, a machine explicitly designed to save labor that instead intensified human bondage on a scale that added 4 million people to America's enslaved population within 2 decades, fueling a plantation economy so profitable it helped push the United States into civil war. And today, in a supply chain spanning continents and involving some of the largest clothing brands on the planet, credible, documented evidence points to forced labor still shaping a meaningful share of the cotton woven into ordinary clothing sold in ordinary stores, worn by people who, in the overwhelming majority of cases, have absolutely no idea where their shirt actually came from or whose hands picked the fiber inside it. Cotton did not simply clothe the world. It shaped empires, crushed industries, intensified slavery at precisely the moment machinery should have ended it, and it continues right now to carry forward a pattern of exploited labor that stretches back far further than most people wearing cotton today would ever imagine. The fiber touching your skin right now carries 5,000 years of history inside it, and a disturbing amount of that history is still being written. If this changed the way you think about the clothes in your closet, hit subscribe and let us know in the comments which part of cotton's history surprised you the most, and share this with someone who has never once thought about where their shirt actually came from.